Okay, I just wanted to thank once again the Sampson County beekeepers for hosting this latest webinar. By their request, we thought that it would be a good time of year actually to talk about the importance of bees as pollinators. This is something that is germane to all of us as beekeepers, and something that I know we're kind of preaching to the choir as to the importance that bees have. But just kind of explore a little bit about pollination itself, how the honeybee population has been experiencing some problems, and how the pollinator population and supply is kind of tenuous right now, as well as the important crops that are pollinated by bees, and how we derive that a third of everything we eat relies on honeybee pollination. So before we do that, I'd like to remind everybody of some things that are going on. First and foremost, in a couple weeks is going to be the annual NCSBA Summer Conference. This year it's going to be in Pinehurst, or in Southern Pines. We've had the NCSBA Summer Conference there several years ago, and it was really a fantastic event. Larry Connor is going to be headlining the conference, and is really going to be looking like it's going to be a terrific event. So definitely try and make that, because it's 2 or 3 days of a lot of information and meeting up with a lot of other beekeepers that's really not to be missed. I also want to announce for anybody who might be interested that we're going to be offering an online bee course, an online 2-day short course on advanced bee breeding. I actually now realize that I forgot to update this information, so ignore that here. I will in fact do it so you can't read it. There we go, good. That's kind of embarrassing. But the online bee breeding course is going to be through the same Collaborate software package, but it's going to be a live session talking about advanced bee breeding and genetics. So this is not targeted towards people who want to start raising queens and kind of understand how to do that. This is actually targeted for those who are already raising queens, but they want to take it to that next level of being able to select their stock and actually breed for particular traits. And so it's not as straightforward as it might sound, and a lot goes into it, understanding some fundamentals of genetics and breeding theory and selection design. And so it's going to be 1.5 really days on July 26th and 27th. So a Friday afternoon and all day Saturday is going to be this online course. It's $150 per person. But it's a lot of information, and it really is. There really isn't a whole lot out there that allows for people who are raising queens to really want to take it to the next level. So be on the lookout for that. More information, of course, is on our website. And in fact, today I just opened up the registration, so the registration form is on our website for anybody who might be interested. Okay, so to talk a little bit about pollination. You know, I'm an academic, I'm a university professor, so I always like to start with definitions of exactly what we're going to be discussing. And so the definition of pollination is the transfer of a male's reproductive cells, that is the pollen, to the female structures of a flower, either its own flower or another flower, that is the stigma of the flower. So really pollination is the transfer of the male to the female part of plants. Of course, plants cannot move, and so oftentimes they require a go-between in order to facilitate that transfer. A lot of species like pine trees and corn and other grasses, they use the wind to disperse the pollen, and so they cast a huge amount of pollen into the air, and it gets carried by the wind downwind to female flowers and fertilize and pollinate and fertilize that way. However, flowering plants, the angiosperms, have developed a means to attract go-betweens, animal go-betweens, and in particular, bees are really perfectly designed for this purpose. So this is an anatomy of a flower. The petals are right here. These are the female structures right here. This is the stigma right here. And the ovules are the female sexual cells of the plant. And so what happens is that an insect, like a bee, will go to the male structures of the flower, the anthers, and they get coated with pollen. Of course, we know that bees eat pollen, so they're there to eat the pollen in order to bring that back to their hive. But it also, they don't necessarily collect it all, and they have a residual amount of pollen on their hairy bodies. And so when they go and visit the next flower, what happens is they deposit a few dozen, maybe a few hundred pollen grains onto the stigma of the next flower that they visit. And so those pollen grains then germinate. They grow their pollen tube down the long shaft of the stigma down until they fertilize the ovule in the ovary of the flower. So that's the fertilization part, where you actually have the uniting of the male and female halves, and what results in that is a seed. And around that seed is what grows the fruit. So the fruit is kind of the delivery device of the seed, so that other animals can come along, eat the fruit, contains the seed, and then they can carry that away and scatter and deposit those seeds away from the parent plant. So without the fruit carrying the seeds, you wouldn't be able to complete the life cycle of whatever plant you're talking about here. And without the pollination, you wouldn't get that fertilization that would develop in the seed. So the pollination is really, really critical to the life cycle of all of these flowering plants, and different plant species have devised different go-betweens for insect pollination or for animal pollination. Now, these are just some live pictures, actually, or raw pictures of the anthers. These are the male structures that carry the pollen. And then, of course, you have the stigma. This is the female structure on which the pollen becomes deposited. Now, different pollen sources, that is, different species of plants, have unique size and shapes of their pollen grains. And so they actually fit like a lock and key on the female structures, so that only the pollen from that particular species will fertilize the ovules of that particular species. So you don't have a whole lot of cross-pollination, one size fits all. So you actually have lots of different types of pollen for the different plants that are being pollinated. But nonetheless, because bees have a high fidelity to the different plants that they're collecting their pollen and their nectar from, this is why they're such efficient pollinators, because they tend to go to the same species blossom after blossom after blossom, which greatly facilitates the actual pollination from the plant's perspective. Okay, now as you all know, honeybees are the primary insect pollinator that's used in agriculture. We'll see as we get later on in the presentation that there are plenty of other bees and other pollinators out there, but when it comes to commercial production pollination, honeybees are hands down the #1 bee and pollinating insect that's used worldwide. And that's because they're just so amenable to the way that we grow crops. There are tens of thousands of bees within a hive. They live throughout the year, so they don't have a limited life cycle. They live throughout the year, and they can be trucked in and out of orchards or crops depending on their need. So they're very flexible. They're very amenable to the way that we use them in agriculture. And because of that, they become extremely popular and, in fact, indispensable for our food supply. Now, most of commercial pollination is done by beekeepers that move their hives like this. That isn't to diminish the importance that backyard beekeepers have or that smaller scale beekeepers have, but by and large, most of our food is pollinated by bees that are stacked onto flatbed semi-trailers like this, often with forklifts or other sort of mechanical assistance. And then a big tarp is thrown over them so that they don't fly as they're being transported, and then they go on down the highway and go and are placed then back out into various orchards and fields that the beekeeper is contracting with the growers of that particular crop. Now, this kind of so-called migratory beekeeping is where, in fact, most of the beehives within the United States, that's who owns most of the beehives. So there's about 2.4 million beehives in the United States. And the vast majority of those are owned by a very, very small minority of beekeepers. And they're the ones that have thousands, if not tens of thousands of colonies, and they tend to move their bees on these flatbed trucks following the bloom as these different crops come into flowering. So a lot of them overwinter in the south, in Texas or in Florida or Southern California, Arizona, and then as spring kind of moves up northward, they then go to these different places where they move their hives up to blueberries in Michigan or in Maine, cranberries, the cranberry bogs in New Jersey, and of course in California, most of the beehives in the United States, about 1.5 million of the 2.4 million beehives, go out to Northern California to pollinate the almond crop. So it is an incredibly important crop for most managed commercial beehives in the United States. And so a lot of these different migratory operations will move, on average, about 8,000 miles per year is what the average beehive in the U.S. actually travels because of these migratory routes that a lot of these beekeepers take. There's another traditional north-south route in the plains, and these are mostly beekeepers not for pollination necessarily, but for honey production, and a lot of the clover honey that is very standard on the shelves of your American Megamart really comes from operations there. So bees move a lot and obviously are very, very important for this pollination aspect that makes them indispensable. Now, as you all know, beekeepers and beehives have been declining over recent years, and in fact there's a very kind of standard figure now where right after the Second World War there was about 6 million colonies of bees in the U.S. And there's been a slow decrease in the number of beehives in the United States ever since then. And so, as I said, now there's about 2.4 or so million beehives in the United States. This is not due to a single factor. The consolidation of family farms, large-scale agribusiness, more people moving to the city, and then, of course, the things that we know about as beekeepers, parasitic mites, nosema, introduced exotic pests such as small hive beetle, viruses, pesticides. A lot of these things all kind of interact and result in making it harder and harder for bees to stay healthy and productive, and therefore there's fewer beekeepers now than there used to be, and correspondingly fewer beehives than there used to be. This is a figure that shows the challenges that beekeepers have been facing in recent years, dating back to the winter of 2006, 2007. There have been these surveys that have been conducted most recently by the Bee Informed Partnership, really asking beekeepers how many hives have you lost this past year, and what was an acceptable range for your losses. This past year, there was a 31.5% decline in the managed honeybee population, which is up almost over 9 percentage points from last year. It looked like the past few years things were getting better, that the mortality, that the die-offs weren't as bad. This year there was a very significant uptick in the number of honeybees that were lost. I do want to make the distinction that there's 31% fewer beehives coming out of winter than went into winter this past year. However, during this same survey, the beekeepers, when asked what percentage of your beehives have you lost, the average was about 45%. So your average beekeeper lost about 45%, or almost half of their hives. Now the reason for the difference there is that most beekeepers, as I said before, are smaller scale hobbyist beekeepers, whereas most beehives are owned by larger scale operators. So most of the beehives in the U.S. are owned by them, and their winter losses were not as bad as your average beekeeper. And so that's why the honeybee population in the U.S. Lost 31%, but your average beekeeper, you and I, have lost almost half of our bees. So it was a very, very bad winter for a whole number of reasons. One thing that I'm asked, though, a lot is it due to colony collapse disorder? And I was able to get this one picture of colony collapse disorder just after it happened. But this is actually not what we usually think about colony collapse disorder. We're usually thinking about this phenomenon, the bees just simply disappearing. I do want to emphasize, before we get back to the discussion about pollination, is that we still don't know what's causing colony collapse disorder, but we shouldn't lump every reason why bees die into this unknown syndrome called colony collapse disorder. This is done a lot in the media. It's something that would try and keep distinct, but there's a lot of reasons why bees die, and so we as beekeepers really need to keep our eye on the ball of those things that we know we can do something about, rather than kind of constantly fear this boogeyman of CCD. That said, because we don't know what's going on and what's causing it, I think it's really imperative that we try and figure that out in case it's going to get worse, or that it could be a problem that we're not really going to be easily able to address. So all that said, even though there are a lot fewer beehives now than there used to be, and there is kind of this overall struggle to maintain a sustainable and viable pollinator population, honeybees are still absolutely indispensable to over 100 crops that are grown in the United States. And I'm listing only a few of them here, but what we'll do is we'll kind of go through, not necessarily crop by crop, but kind of crop group by group, and really kind of discuss the importance of these different crops and how honeybees really play a role, either directly or indirectly, in bringing that particular thing to our table. Now, I should mention that these figures are a bit dated. They were published in the year 2000. So it's estimated that they're increased correspondingly since then. But the relative ratios, I think, and the importance of bees that play in these different cropping systems, I think still ring true. So what these series of graphs talk about is that the crop itself is named on the left, And then at least in 2000, the value of that particular crop in millions of dollars. So here the apple industry actually back then was worth $1.5 billion. Okay? This column here signifies the dependence of that particular crop on any sort of insect pollination for seed and then fruit set. So if it's a 1, that means it's in 100% reliant on insect pollination. If it's 0, then it relies not at all on insect pollination, such as corn or something like that. This column here is the estimated percentage of those insects that do the pollinating that are honeybees. And so what this final column then does is just simply multiply those 3 columns to result in the value of that crop that is directly attributable to honeybees. So for apples, because they are 100% reliant on insect pollination, and the vast majority of those insects are honeybees, 1.3 billion of the 1.5 billion apple crop every year is directly attributable to honeybees. The same is true for blueberries and cherries and cranberries. All of these are very heavily reliant on honeybees for their crop to come to our table. The same is true for many different citrus crops. Even though many of the citrus are not highly reliant on honeybees, the pollinators that pollinate those particular crops, most of them still are honeybees. And so like the $1.8 billion orange industry, still $500 million of that is really attributable to honeybees. The same is true for a lot of other citrus. And a lot of other fruit crops. Even grapes have benefit in some way. The same is true for strawberries. Strawberries, they can self-pollinate, and they can get by just fine as a plant without honeybee pollination. But honeybees coming in and kind of finishing off and really making sure that the pollination is done completely allows for a more shapelier fruit and something that is much more marketable. So honeybees add to the kind of the aesthetic value of strawberries more than they do the yield. And so really for strawberry growers, honeybees are probably more important to them, as these numbers might indicate. As I mentioned before, the almond industry is a real significant economic driver of bee pollination and therefore a lot of the other dynamics going on with pollination and commercial production agriculture. It's estimated now that the almond industry is well over $2 billion a year and is growing. They're planting more almond trees and almond groves in Northern California right now than we have honeybees to pollinate them. So and that is because they are 100% reliant on insect pollination, and all of those insects, or 99% of those, are honeybees. And so they are a very, very important economic driver for the sustainability of the honeybee population. Now, it's not just fruits and nuts, but also different field crops. So it may come to a surprise that alfalfa, which is a huge industry, of course, for cattle feed and others, they are very dependent on insect pollination. A lot of those insects are alfalfa leafcutter bees and other types of bees, but honeybees do do have an appreciable role in the pollination of those crops. And so if you extrapolate, alfalfa seed results in alfalfa hay, which is then fed to cows and important for the dairy industry from where we get the milk. You can actually extrapolate that honeybees are very, very important to, like, the dairy industry. And so it really shows how important honeybees and pollination, the ramifications that it has for our overall food supply. Another surprise perhaps is cotton. Now, it used to be that a really great way to kill off your bee colonies was to place them near a cotton field in the middle of summer. With boll weevil abatement programs and other successful IPM programs, particularly in the southeast, that is not nearly as true anymore as it used to be. And in fact, cotton can make a pretty good midsummer honey crop, even though it can crystallize pretty readily. But more importantly, cotton, believe it or not, the yields can appreciably go up because of honeybee pollination. And so there's an important, maybe not historical, but there's actually an important connection with cotton. Same thing with soybeans. Sunflowers, a lot of these crops that you might not associate very readily with honeybees are in fact very important and dependent on bees to a certain extent. Now, of course, a lot of the vegetable crops are in large part or in small part reliant on honeybees. Anywhere from broccoli, squash, cucumber here in North Carolina is the largest honeybee pollinated crop in the state. Celery, onions, and pumpkins. And a lot of melon crops, a lot of the muskmelons, honeydews, watermelons, pumpkins. So a lot of the cucurbits are very, very highly dependent on honeybee pollination. So that was only a short list of all of the different crops that rely on honeybee pollination. But if you go and you add up all of the value of those different crops, again, back in $2,000, they come to $47 billion every year. And then if you add up that last column, which is the amount that is directly attributable to honeybee pollination, you get 14.6 billion. So this is where it comes from, that honeybees are responsible for about a third of everything we eat. That they really are important for a lot of the fruits and vegetables and even forage crops that are very, very important to us. So the things that are missing from there are things like corn and wheat and rice. Those things are wind pollinated for the most part. So a lot of our staple crops, a lot of the boring stuff. So we wouldn't starve necessarily without honeybees, but all of the healthy fruits and vegetables that define the Western diet, most of them would be gone. And so that's why honeybees are really critical to maintaining a healthy food supply. Now, these pictures just came out today from this PRNewsWire.com. And I think it really captures this subject really, really well. These were pictures taken at a Whole Foods. And the top picture is the produce department when you have bees in our agricultural food supply. And so you see all the plethora of all the different fruits and vegetables available to us. The bottom picture is the choices that you would have if there were no bees pollinating our food. And as you can see, the produce department is darn near empty. And so it really kind of underscores the importance that bees have because of their pollination. I went through this same calculus. It's actually been a while now, 2006. But I went through this same calculus for the values of crops and the different types of crops in North Carolina alone rather than nationwide. But the story is still the same. If you look at all of the different crops that rely on honeybees, their value and the dependence and proportion of those insect pollinators that are honeybees, you come out with about $185 million a year is what honeybees are estimated to add to our North Carolina economy alone. And so I think that really is very telling about the importance of what we do as North Carolina beekeepers. Okay, so what do a lot of the commercial pollinators do when they're moving their hives from place to place? And this is something that we can all do, even as small-scale beekeepers, to help out local growers in need of pollination. And this is also something that we do as beekeepers when we want to move our hives somewhere else for a good honey crop, or if we need to move them away because our neighbor is complaining that there's bees visiting their pool and you want to move them away for a time period so that they're not as much of a nuisance. Whenever you want to move honeybee colonies, this is how you do it. You want to, of course, move them at night. That is because all of the bees will come back to roost at night. They don't fly during the night, but they're flying during the day. So if you move the hive during the day, you lose all your forager force, and it can really significantly hurt the population of the colony. So you wait till night, and you can put some wire screen at the entrance so they still have airflow, but they can't get out. And then you move them to their new site, at least a mile away, but preferably more, so that they don't get confused about orientation and go back to the original site. And then when you get to that final venue, you just open up the screened front entrance, and they will resume foraging the next morning. What happens is that the foragers and the scout bees will come out the next morning and recognize that they're in a completely new environment. So all of their memories of where the food was located in their previous location is now moot. So a lot of the foragers go out and scout for new sites and for new floral sources that they can forage on. Now, the beekeepers, the pollinators, take advantage of this, and they place those hives into the target crop of whatever they have been contracted to pollinate for a particular farmer. They put those hives in when the crop is at about 10% bloom. It's kind of a magic number because what happens is that the bees will come out, and some of the very first flowers that they're going to encounter are that target crop. And if it is in bloom, then they will learn that location, and they will lock into that particular crop and therefore visit it until it is no longer, right? And they do that because of that principle of floral constancy, where when bees start visiting a flower type, as long as that flower is profitable and yielding, they will continue to pollinate that until it's depleted. So if the beekeeper moves their hives into a crop where it's already in bloom, then they're not going to get as much pollination as they would otherwise. If the beekeeper moves the hives into the crop before it starts blooming, then what is going to happen is that the bees are going to find floral sources elsewhere, lock on to those, and they may or may not actually discover the huge field of cucumbers that may be right in front of them. This is particularly true for fields or for crops that are not as highly attractive in the first place, such as cucurbits or others, where the bees, it can be hard to get the bees attracted to those particular blossoms. So moving the bees in at about 10% bloom really helps to optimize making sure that the bees pollinate that particular crop rather than go elsewhere. Now, another question that often comes up is not just when during the day do you move them or when the crop is concerned, but where do you move them and how many hives do you move into a particular crop? So another thing that's important to know from the bees' perspective is that they tend to forage closer to the hive than further away. Why go far away for your food when you can get it really close? So they tend to venture only as far out as they need to. So in a very heavy blossom crop, let's take blueberries for example, they really don't go very far into the crop or into the field because there's so many blossoms available to them, right outside their front door. So in those types of cases, what the beekeepers often do, or they're contracted to do, is to place their hives around the entire area rather than just setting them down on one corner of the field, because they may not actually visit flowers all the way over on the other side. So a lot of farmers request that beekeepers will place their hives around, or even if it's a very large field, inside the field to really make sure that they adequately pollinate the entire field rather than just a subsection kind of closest to the hive. Other crops that don't have nearly as many blossoms, it's not as high a priority for the grower or for the beekeeper, that they will venture further out because there are fewer crops. So it depends from crop to crop, grower to grower, field to field. Another question is, how many beehives do you put into a particular crop? And the answer is, again, depends very greatly on the crop in question. The default number, kind of your standard generic number, is 1 hive per acre. So that's 50,000 bees or so within a hive per acre. Tends to be good coverage for most cropping systems. Now, again, that number varies tremendously depending on how many blossoms there are and how attractive they are. So blueberries, again, I'll use that as an example and an important one here in North Carolina. They like to contract about 5 hives per acre because there are just so many blossoms that their yields just keep going correspondingly up the more bees that there are. Others like cucurbits can get away with maybe 1 hive every 2 acres, depending, again, on different situations. So it really varies a lot depending on what the grower wants and what the crop actually really requires for optimal seed and then fruit set. So this is another very important aspect, kind of the interface of beneficial insects and pollinators with pest insects that the growers don't want. The insects that's going to eat their crop and harm their plants or their fruit. And so a lot of growers are interested in getting the pollination and the beneficial insects, but they're also interested in killing off the bad insects. And so this is often a very difficult interface between beekeeper and grower because their needs may be different. What is really good at killing a pest insect is usually pretty darn good at killing a beneficial insect like honeybees. And so being on the same page when it comes to minimizing mortality of bees during pesticide applications is really, really important in these particular contexts. And so what a lot of beekeepers that are contracting with these growers, they like to ask them to do the following. They like to make sure that if they are applying any pesticides that they're following the label. The label is the law, that they need to and on most of the harmful pesticides to bees say specifically on the label that they're not allowed to spray when bees are visiting the blossoms. That there are protections in the label to try to mitigate problems on bees. But there are also differences in the toxicity of different pesticides out there that they could use. So if there is an option to ask them to choose the less toxic alternative, if there are differences between them. Another thing that's very, very important is for the grower to notify the beekeeper before they do any spraying, especially if they're unscheduled, so that they have enough time to go into the fields and even move them out so that their colonies are not negatively affected. Another good way to try and prevent poisonings by pesticides is to request the growers spray during the evening or at night or even the late afternoon. Because what happens, again, when the bees come home to roost at night, if they can spray during that time, there's no foragers out on the field, and many of these pesticides, the active ingredient can break down over the course of a few hours overnight, so that by the time that foraging of the bees resume, it's much, much less toxic, if at all, when the bees go back out and visit the flowers. So spraying at night is something that can really help minimize bee mortality. One final thing is that dusts aren't as good, or kind of the worst case scenario, because they can actually be picked up by the bees just like pollen, and they can bring it back to their hives, feed it to the young, and can really kill off an entire colony very quickly. Liquid spray, especially fine mists, can result in a lot of drift, and that can also more negatively affect bees. But the best types, if at all possible, are granular applications of pesticides. So the formulation of how it's delivered can also be helpful to try and mitigate pesticide problems. Now, for the beekeeper, it's really important for you to also be involved, and that is to notify yourself of what the particular grower is spraying, and be on the same page with them as to what their needs are going to be, and work with them and try to work around their particular schedule. You want to work with the nearby growers to inform them of these different options, and to have them choose the less toxic alternatives and the formulations. And then if you have to, move the colonies away, or in a real pinch, you can actually cover the colonies with a wetted tarp to keep them cool, but so that the bees aren't going to be able to fly out and become exposed to a particular pesticide. But that, of course, is at a last result. You know, moving them away during times of spray, if it's really going to be harmful to the bees, is obviously the best solution for the beekeeper. Should say all of this is outlined in the annual Ag Chem manual that's available online through NC State Cooperative Extension. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here a little bit and just talk a little bit about some of the collaborative studies that we've been engaged in here at NC State and through our apiculture program. One was on cucurbits, specifically seedless watermelons. This is done with Jonathan Schulteis in the horticulture department. And what we did is really looking at the densities of beehives and what is optimal for seedless watermelon. A lot of the information about the importance of pollination in watermelon is done on seeded watermelons, but now over 80% of the watermelons sold in the state and nationwide is seedless. And we know that on a flower-by-flower basis, the pollination requirements of seedless watermelons are greater than those of the normal seeded watermelons. So how many hives does it take per acre to really effectively pollinate seedless watermelons is something that we don't really have a very good handle on. So in collaboration with Jonathan and his crew, we looked at 27 different fields, and of various different sizes, from large to small, and we looked at, we walked up and down the rows of the transects. So we walked up and down the watermelon rows, And every time that we saw a flying insect, we noted the distance, direction, the location, and the type of insect that it was, and I'll show those results or I'll show those results in a moment here. And we did 147 transects that were very, very long. So it ended up that we walked almost 8 miles of watermelon fields trying to look at what is pollinating the watermelons under these different conditions. And I should mention that that Alan Thornton was really the one who spearheaded this and got all of these 27 fields together, and the growers, as well as knowing how many beehives were at each of these fields, so that we could look at the number of hives per acre and then compare across different fields and different hive densities to see what that effect had on the pollinator community. So really big help to Alan Thornton for putting a lot of this together. And this was done down in Sampson County, I should mention. So what we found that the majority of the pollinators in these seedless watermelon fields were in fact honeybees. So 57% were honeybees. But what that means is that 43% of the pollinating insects that we saw on the blossoms of these watermelons were not honeybees, which is very interesting. And they ranged everywhere from butterflies to and even wasps and some flies, but bumblebees, megachilids, or kind of large solitary bees, as well as small solitary bees such as halictids and sweat bees and things like that. So this really shows that there's a complex of different pollinators in agricultural settings, and they are also important, as are honeybees. But the vast majority, the real heavy lifting of pollination that's being done are honeybees in these fields. Now again, because Alan had set up these different fields that varied in their size and the number of hives, we were able to calculate the number of hives per acre and specifically varied it so that there were only some growers that had 1 hive every 2 or even 5 acres. And then we had others where they put out in excess of 5 hives per acre, and then everything in between. And so what was interesting about these results across these 27 different fields is that the more hives are per acre that's put out, the more honeybees you have pollinating those blossoms. So that's actually a really good finding to verify that the more bees you put out, the more pollination you get. So that's in fact very important to demonstrate. But more importantly, what another very interesting result that came from these preliminary data is that the density of the honeybees within the field, so going from 0 to 50% of the bees being honeybees in the field, it did not appreciably affect the density of those other bees. So there's a lot of debate about, as you move honeybees into an agricultural setting, what it does is it drives out those other beneficial pollinators. And so what we actually found was that wasn't the case at all. And in fact, if anything, there seemed to be a positive relationship, so that you have a complementarity going on where as you're augmenting the field with honeybees, you're not driving away or losing those other beneficial pollinators as well that can be equally important for pollination. So it doesn't seem like you're losing anything by adding honeybees, you're just gaining more bees, and that's exactly what is beneficial for pollination and for the grower. Now in another collaboration, this is done in collaboration with Dr. Hannah Barak's lab, who is our small fruit specialist here in entomology, and our joint student who's now graduated, Shelley Rogers. She did a pollination study in blueberries. So blueberries, as I said before, very, very heavily dependent on honeybee pollination, but in other insects as well. And so what she did is she went to these different blueberry plantations, and she caged the blueberry blossoms with this netting. And then as that blossom opened up, she took the netting off, sat there very patiently, and waited for an insect to come along and pollinate it. Once she saw that insect pollinating, she noted which species did the pollinating, carpenter bees, honeybees, the southeastern blueberry bee, so on and so forth. And then she caged that blossom back up so that nobody else would come and pollinate it again. And so these are single visit pollination efficiencies where she harvested the blueberry from that caged branch and then counted the number of seeds in that blueberry as an indication of how well it was pollinated. And so as you can see from this graph, honeybees tend not to be as efficient a pollinator as, say, bumblebees or some of those halictid sweat bees. So on a bee-for-bee basis, honeybees may not be the best pollinator out there. But because there are so fewer of these small native bees and bumblebees, honeybees make up for that by having a greater number of pollinators. And so we really show that there's, again, this need for complementarity where honeybees are important for their numbers, but these other bees are also important for their efficacy and how well they are able to pollinate these crops. Other data that she shows is that honeybees are not as amenable for inclement weather conditions, whereas some of these other bees are more robust and more hardy to forage during less favorable weather. And so again, depending on what the weather is, different cropping systems may need these different species and a diversity of different pollinators in order to really optimize their seed and then fruit set. So I'll leave on this last note, and that is kind of a call to arms among all of us beekeepers here in North Carolina, large and small, and that the different crops that we have in the state, the recommended number of hives per acre that they garner, and then the acreage that we have, it then says how many hives are we going to need in order to meet our pollination demands within the state. If you add all of those up, it's over 130,000 beehives. It's estimated that we only have about 100,000 beehives in the state, although we don't really have very good numbers on that because we don't have mandatory registration. And so, in essence, it suggests that we really need every hive that we can get helping to pollinate our local food supply. And so, together with the NCDA and their apiary inspection program, we launched several years ago this website called BeeLink, which is right here. And what it is just like an online bulletin board for beekeepers that have hives for pollination, and then growers who are in need of hives for pollination, for them to link up with each other. And the idea is that it can be really tragic that a fairly small grower that only has like a 2-acre plot of cucumbers, a lot of large-scale beekeepers might not want to provide that 1 or 2 hives. It might not be worth their time to contract with them. But there are local hobbyists or small-scale beekeepers that are very willing to make, you know, $30, $40, $50 per hive and just move them on down the road and help out that grower and help out their bees as well. And so being able to link up between grower and beekeeper is what this site is all about, and it's something that so far has really been underutilized, I think, but it has a lot of promise to be able to address our pollination needs within the state. And so with that, I'll just leave you with this thought that it's been long known, dating back to the 19th century, that growers would find their occupation gone if honeybees and other pollen insects were out of existence. And that very much remains true today, and it is exactly why honeybees are so important to our food supply. So I just want to remind everybody that the next seminar is going to be on September 15th. This one is going to be hosted by our very own Rockingham County beekeepers. We've actually already set up the topic. There seems to be a great demand to know about what beekeepers should know about viruses and their effects on colony health. And it's actually something that we have a lot of involvement in with the Bee Informed Partnership, where we're doing all of the virus screens for that ongoing effort. And so we have a lot of data and a big story to tell when it comes to viruses. And it's something that is invisible to us as beekeepers, but I think is really, really important for overall colony health. So be sure to save that date on September 5th, and we hope to see you all then. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Yeah, go ahead, Rockingham. Either hit the talk button or type it in.
We know what to do. We're discussing what our question is.
Oh, okay.
We think you've explained everything so well that we just don't have a question.
That's a very nice way of saying that everybody over there is asleep. But thank you very much. I appreciate that.
No, we're not.
Samson, you guys got, do you have any questions? Oh. Here's a question from Roberta. What do I use to cover my bees when aerial spraying is occurring? Yeah, I'm sorry if I glossed over that, but again, hopefully that is a very, very last resort kind of emergency kind of triage situation. But what is recommended in the Ag Chemical Manual is to actually cover the bees with a fairly heavy tarp, and then to wet it down so that evaporative cooling will keep the bees fairly cool so that they don't overheat. And in that way, there's going to be no mist or no pesticide that's really able to penetrate that. But that, again, is a really last resort and only something if you have to do it. Now, if you're spraying in your own backyard and you have complete control over both of those things, you can cover the bees, but again, try and spray at night. So you can cover the bees at night, cover the beehive at night, and then spray your garden or whatever at night. And then by the next morning, you'll be able to take that tarp off, and the active ingredient is probably broken down, so it's not going to be nearly as much of a problem. But yeah, a heavy tarp or something that is going to be able to be wetted so that it will keep the bees cool, but also prevent any pesticide from getting interest into the hive. So here's another question. What should we recommend to our neighbors who have a small home garden and want to control insects by spraying? Great question. I probably should have done a little more of homework. I'm really not all that familiar with a lot of the uses of pesticides that are used in different different contexts. I know that most over-the-counter, the stuff that you get at Lowe's or Home Depot, the real major culprit is 7 dust, right? And so to control for squash and cucumber beetles, that's a pretty common application for that. What is a good alternative? See, the reason why 7-dust is so popular is that it controls a lot of different things. It's used in a lot of different things. But what are some pesticides that are specifically good at controlling squash or cucumber beetles or something else, but not really all that harmful to honeybees? I'm not entirely sure. Again, that would be good to look up in the different tables of in the Ag Chemical Manual to see exactly what those alternatives are. So on page 76, I believe, are these tables that list pesticides that are highly toxic, moderately toxic, or relatively non-toxic to bees. And then you can go to the different growing crops and you can see what are the alternatives for a particular pest, and then find those in that table for their relative harmfulness to bees, and see if you can choose the lesser of the two evils there. So again, that varies a lot. It really shows my ignorance when it comes to the use of pesticides. It's really not my area of expertise. But there's a lot of literature out there, and it's constantly changing too, with all the different chemistries that are coming and going. So it really depends, and it really helps for you to look those things up when the time comes. Any other questions? Well, I certainly appreciate your, oh, sorry, go ahead, Samson. Della, you guys got a question?
Okay, fruit trees, is that the same way you sprayed in at night, the blossoms, with the blossoms on?
Yeah, fruit trees are exactly the same way. That a lot of the problems with certain fruit trees, and almonds is another good example of this, is that, you know, a lot of times the growers don't like to spray at night because they can't see where they're going, right? And so sometimes it's difficult to convince them that spraying at night is the way to go. The other problem that comes into fruit trees is that a lot of them have these fungi, these pathogenic fungi that infect the blossoms. Now, if you look up in those same tables of those pesticides that are relatively not harmful to honeybees, a lot of them, fungi, are included on that list because a very large, a very high dosage of fungicides is what's needed to kill honeybees because they're targeted at killing off fungi, not insects, right? So fungicides and herbicides tend to be not as harmful to honeybees as, say, insecticides, right? So what beekeepers take, from growers take from that is, well, you know, since these are relatively non-toxic to honeybees, we can spray them even though the honeybees are foraging on the blossoms, right? Now, more recent evidence is suggesting that two things seem to be happening and can be very problematic. One is that a lot of growers, for the sake of convenience and efficiency, they often mix different pesticides together in the same tank as they're spraying. And so sometimes they forget and they're spraying the fungicides and they accidentally or they don't think about the connection, and they add insect growth regulators or other insecticides into the same mix, and that can have a harmful effect on bees. But another more sinister one perhaps is that the fungicides can be picked up by the bees and brought back to their hive, and again, while relatively non-toxic to themselves as adults, there are beneficial fungi that live inside the beehive and help break down the pollen into bee bread that is digestible to the developing larvae. So with those fungicides can then kill off those beneficial fungi inside the hives, making the pollen inedible by the bees. And so you can have these nutritional problems of developing bees because of these fungicides, even though they're not really all that toxic to the bees. So there's a lot of problems that can encounter here when it comes to this interface between bees as pollinators and growers. But it's something that, again, working with the growers and being on the same page is really, really important. And so doing all of those things for fruit trees is exactly the same for others, but also knowing the unique aspects of a particular fruit cropping system like apples is also really important as well. Well, with that, I think I'm going to stop the recording here. We'll be able to take some more questions, but I just wanted to thank you again for Sampson County hosting, and thank you very much.